Hello and welcome back. This is MC1 Gamer bringing you another video about Age of Sigmar. Vince Ventrella from Warhammer Weekly put up a video just recently, as he does each week. He has his topic of the week. And in this one, he asked about scenarios and made some commentary about scenarios. So I had been planning to do a video talking about this. I have actually talked about this on forums. I've talked about this on several of my own videos. There's a whole lot that I have to say about scenarios in Age of Sigmar. And it has a lot to do with how people look at the game when they play it, how they come away from it, how the game plays to people who have maybe some preconceived notions from previous versions of Warhammer, specifically 8th edition being the most recent before Age of Sigmar, and other game type systems, and how scenarios can impact that gameplay experience, how it can become a positive or a negative one. Now, just to illustrate some of the points before I get into that, let me first say this. I think scenarios are the absolute lifeblood of Age of Sigmar. I think it's essential that Age of Sigmar be played very scenario focused, very scenario centric. Now, anybody who's played Warhammer before knows that, especially in a fantasy environment, there's the tried and tired, the old battle line is mainly what people played. It's the easiest. It's the simplest. Line up, deploy, line up, and fight, and see who destroys the most. And it was probably the scenario that most people are familiar with because it's the easiest. It's also the one that was the most gratifying in terms of the destruction of your opponent and the way to measure, the killability of your units versus the survivability of your enemies. And unfortunately, this became the staple of most previous editions, not because any of Warhammer editions were designed around that, but mainly because the tournament scene adopted it and it became part of the community go-to default scenario, which I really kind of hated. But I also contributed to this because if there ever was a game that you didn't have to, if you met somebody and it was a pickup game and you wanted just a simple way of, setting up and going, this was the easiest way to go. And in many ways, as a rank and flank type game, Warhammer 8th edition specifically, again, since it's the most recent edition and the one I remember the most, prior to Age of Sigmar, it kind of worked fairly well in that regard because there was obviously enough dimension to the gameplay and that style of gameplay that you could still have a very interesting game. But with comp systems and with restrictions, things like no special characters and certain types of having a point structure, all that stuff. Even though points were part of every edition of Warhammer up until Age of Sigmar, they were all built around the idea of trying to balance the game and trying to make the game as fair and even as possible from the get-go, which again lend itself to a competitive environment. It made sense. If these are the points that are assigned, even if there are units which invariably happen, were overpowered or undercosted, or vice versa, you had a way to compare units and their power strength based on a point scale. It was easy. It was the kind of thing that that made sense. A lot of game systems have done it. The majority of these types of games use some form of point system, and even though there's some of the historical games have there's a lot of historical games that don't use point systems, and it's amazing that people forget about that stuff. In any case, Warhammer really at its core was meant to be a scenario-driven game. The scenarios in the books, the original hardcover books, or in each of the editions, were filled with scenarios. I mean, it was like 6 scenarios, and people mostly played the battle line one, but there were scenarios. Some of the famous ones, holding the watchtower, for example. These things had a different character and forced you to work in a different way and had advantages for different types of armies and that had strengths to doing that type of stuff as opposed to some that didn't. For example, Bretonnians just sucked at the watchtower, and units like dwarves or other units that other units, armies like the dwarves or others that were really, really good when they were able to take that watchtower because they could defend it very well. But and similar examples. But when you look at if you take away the tournament system, that really was taken over by the community after GW abandoned it. Uh, it was meant to be scenarios, and in fact, all of the books, the story books that had a series of scenarios, were all built on a story. They're built on a linked string of games that you played in succession to tell a tale. That was really that was the core of what made Warhammer so unique, and what was very much abandoned by the organized competitive circuit. It's the kind of thing that I love to dive into. Even most recently with End Times, I started playing them. My intention was to play all of them. Of course, I never was able to. That was a heavy lift, and even so, they were not balanced. They're not meant to be balanced. And if you looked at any of these previous versions of that before End Times, going all back over several years, you'll see that there's a progression in these tales where one side would have seemingly much better powers or bonuses or benefits and maybe force structure versus the other. It was not an even match by any stretch of the imagination in each one of these games. And none of them were just a simple battle line. There were objectives to achieve. There were objectives to deny. There were places to go around the board that you had that dealt with a certain types of scenery structures. There was a tale involved in each one of those games in those books that you could see was the next installment of a greater story that encompassed that entire book, that entire collection. And I think that's really where, unfortunately, a lot of the community kind of let that stuff go. They bought it. They maybe flirted with it a little bit. Maybe they played with it once and then they abandoned it. And some people just never even looked at it. So, but let's move forward into Age of Sigmar. I think the gameplay of Age of Sigmar yearns for it, craves it, needs it. It's a requirement, in my opinion, to have a good gameplay. A good example would be my first experiences with Age of Sigmar before I started my unlocking series, where out of sheer determination, I said, I'm going to test the shit out of this game until I can unlock it and find out, everything I can find out about it, and really, determine if this is the course of action I'm going to take, if I'm going to continue with this game. Because my first couple of games were not great. And it was kind of a duplication to a lot of other people's experiences when they were, again, taking the notions, the experiences they had with 8th edition and maybe other editions of Warhammer, bringing it to table, lining up and just having a battle. And what happened in many cases is they would have what was called the scrum in the middle. They would have coalesced around a central point, and everything would just have this collage of battle without any scenario. Now, this wouldn't happen every time. It was happening more often than not because of the way it was played, because of the way the game plays. The game allows for tremendous amounts of drink, for anybody who knows the Tremendous game. It allows tremendous amounts of flexibility in tactics, in maneuverability, it's just asking for that overlay of scenarios to give a story to it, to give a not as much a structure, but a direction, a goal, more than just, hey, we're here to fight. And it allows for a complete imbalance because of the lack of points. You do not need points in Age of Sigmar. What you need are scenarios to guide you. And not just one scenario, several, because the game should not be played as an individual game in a vacuum. It needs to be played as a string of games. But going back to my experience, I tested out with some local people, some YouTubers, in fact, like Anthony from the Sustainable Center. And we had this really weird experience. And some people would take that experience and say, I hate it, and burn their armies, and or give up and run away. And some people took it and like myself, and said, I'm going to keep trying to explore this and see what this needs. It needs a little bit. It needs some salt. It needs some pepper. It needs some paprika. It needs some kind of flavor here because there's something missing. And that's where I was. I was like, there's something here. I just couldn't tell what it was. And as I got, I started to unlock it and analyze it, and I learned that the meat and bones of this game is beyond just the core 4 pages. Is really where the war scrolls are. That's where the real explanation of how deep and how flexible and how complex this game really is. But then I started trying to play some of the scenarios out of the first hardcover books, and then even created some my own as a demo, because I was demoing with a lot of these people, some veterans, some new players, and I've been doing that at least a handful a month, 1 or 2, not every weekend, but most weekends. I'm demoing. At least I'm doing it this Sunday. I'm demoing at a local shop on Highlander Games and Comics in was it Cedar Knolls? I think it is, and is it Cedar Knolls? I think it's Cedar Knolls in northern New Jersey. And I just a couple people who are more 40K people. They had an interest in potentially looking at fantasy after some posts and after seeing some stuff. I said, hey, I'll meet up with you. We kind of game at the same shops. They're coming down and they're going to go and try it out. I'm going to do another demo day, and I did one 2 weeks ago. So the bottom line is that when I started creating these scenarios to try and give some point and purpose to the maneuvering of the units, why you're there, and I didn't really even out the teams. I took a rough, it's a small group for a demo. You don't want to have a whole table full of stuff because it gets too complicated for a new player. But a selection of different unit types. Try to have at least one cav if it's available in that army. One infantry, one monster, one artillery, a hero or two. Just a reasonably small to mid-sized force that gives a flavor of all the different unit types possible. And maybe it's not a lot of synergy, maybe there's not a lot of cohesiveness, but it's something there to give as a demonstration example of how this game is played with all the interlocking pieces, and then making an opposing force that's reasonable there, and then having everybody getting a little bit of experience with the different unit types and different army types and see how they're different. So once I introduced the scenarios, even ones that I made up on the fly, just with an idea that, maybe this force has to protect this piece of terrain and that force has to occupy it, or initiating the sudden death scenarios in some of my own games where we were testing out to see the viability of that, if that really worked, just to see if an imbalanced, army versus an opponent would, and the sudden death scenarios that would kick in would be, in addition to them being viable, if they actually force the action beyond just let's line up and fight. Now I'm focused on that piece of terrain or that character to assassinate or defend. And it did. It really gave it a little more character and purpose than just the lineup battle line type scenario, which again I can't stand. I mean, if I'm teaching mechanic of the game, fine, it's just line up and fight. But I don't think that Age of Sigmar should ever be played just with battle line. It's an inclusion into the game system because you're trying to defeat your opponent, and in part of the defeating your opponent is the destruction of their forces. But if intertwined with that, and sometimes superseding that, is a series of objectives that are part of what this overall scenario is, and the scenario has a storyline, then you're much more invested in it. And Vince brought out a really good point, which is what really is important is, and he used this same type of motion with his hands, and that in a lot of cases in previous editions, the points obtainable, and even in events, even in tournaments, the points obtainable were so skewed towards just destroying your opponent, such that your scenario objectives, being minor, were maybe just a minor differentiator or a bonus or a boon or maybe even a potential tiebreaker, but they weren't incentive enough to get away from the notion that you just were just trying to destroy your opponent. You could even forget scenarios. And I've been in tournaments where people just did, myself included. And that's frustrating because that gets a little boring. And it's an unflavored game. It just lacks depth. And it could be depth in the gameplay in terms of the maneuverability, in terms of the tactics that how well you can utilize the capabilities of your units, and how well you can combat and stymie your opponent. That's fine. There's certain challenge there that some people really like, and those are the people that are very lamenting about the loss of 8th edition, even though it's not really gone anywhere. It's just not supported anymore. But in Age of Sigmar, if you weight the scenario above the killing, the destruction of your opponent paramount to in certain cases to achieving various goals in many ways. If you're defending a structure and your opponent's trying to take it, there's going to be a fight. But there's a reason why you're there. You're not just arbitrarily moving or trying to just basic flank and then crash into the center. You're focused on various different points of contention in the game with a reason, with a rationale. And that's the kind of thing that, and I'll get back to scenarios and link scenarios in a second. I just want to make sure I have that in my mind because that's a point that I'd like to end on. But with the Gamer Grunts, which is a group that I'm with now of veteran players, we're just looking to kind of spread This is Joe and Nelson, and we're just looking to spread the word about Age of Sigmar, and there'll be other games that Gamer Grunts is involved in, because there's certain people in the group that are really good at certain, really into certain different types of game systems. Right now, we're really into AoS, because we want to try and promote the game, try and give people who are interested an opportunity to play and create an organized circuit and help out a lot of these local and support some of these local game stores that are looking to have people kind of take the lead. They play many different game systems at these stores. Maybe they haven't really given Age of Sigmar a chance, or maybe they need somebody who maybe has a little more experience at it to try and really show what it's capable of and show the people what it's capable of. And so far, the experience has been very good, as you may have seen from a previous video that I put up, just talking about some recent events that I've been at. But in terms of how we're structuring it, we have different opinions on how we would structure the event games. But the good thing is that if it's a collaboration, we're trying to take the best ideas from each individual person and put it in a blender, and what comes up hopefully is something that doesn't taste like shit. But so far it's doing pretty well, and the feedback we're getting is pretty good, and we've enjoyed ourselves as well. But the crux of it, of what we built in our scenarios, is that the point structure, this really lends itself to what Vince's point was. The point structure really is skewed towards achieving the goals in the scenario. While you can get points for just destroying your opponent, it's not going to win you the game. Realistically, when you look at the array of victory points you can achieve throughout each of these games, yeah, you can potentially win by just destroying your opponent, but there's so many more options within the objective lists and the things you need to do, that where it would be ridiculously rare for somebody to win just by destroying their opponent. Everybody would else basically have to just drop the entire scenario structure. It's just too enticing you'll see, I'll do a write-up on all of our scenarios, but you can also go to you can also get a gamergrunts.com, or go to the Facebook page and check it out. You can download it. We're in the process of revising some stuff and updating some stuff after our first experience to introduce and implement for the next series of events that we have in the calendar for March. So there will be some changes based on feedback and based on our own experiences, because we played, each of us played games in the very first event. But the overriding theme of these scenarios is that you are going to gain far more victory points based on achieving various objectives. And if you just try to kill your opponent is trying to achieve scenarios, you're almost guaranteed a loss. It's not just about the killing. It's part of the equation, but that's not your path to victory. So when Vince had mentioned in his previous video, his topic of the week, that he thinks that it was kind of flipped for previous editions, and this edition the emphasis is more towards scenarios, and really should be, yeah, it should be. And if you're playing Age of Sigmar, if you're interested in Age of Sigmar, you really should be looking at either the hardcover scenario books, making your own, or just creating, even if it's off the cuff. It doesn't have to be something really well fleshed out if you really don't need to. It could be something very simple where you have certain objectives that one side defends and the other side has to achieve, has to gather. Or it could be a moving type scenario. It could be a creature in the middle. It could be movable objects, terrain pieces, or tokens, and you can give them any kind of special effect, or they could be an animal, an elemental, a force of nature, like a tree. The tribe scenario I'm building for an event series that I'm doing, which is, one of them is called the Tree of Life. And I won't go into any of the further details, but it's just about having a big goddamn tree in the center of the board. And believe me when I tell you, this is not where you want to be because of all the crazy shenanigans that would go on. You really want to avoid the center of the board. I wanted to have the anti-scrum with this one. So we'll talk about that in a future video. So that's one of the things we're doing at Gamer Grunts. But let me illustrate how I envision Age of Sigmar being played. And I'm going to give you an example that I give and I've used many a time. And I use this usually as a defense on why points are not needed in Age of Sigmar. When you use points and you're trying to create a balanced situation where both sides seemingly are starting at the same point, where they have the same power structure. It's an illusion, first of all. as I said many times, and every edition, there's army lists, there's units, there's monsters, there's characters that are just unbelievably overpowered for what they cost. There's always that really, really good in each book unit that everybody has to take. And then there are some that are just garbage because of their power versus points, even if they're similar to another unit that would be, if they have a similar role in the game, but they may be 2 points more per model. And they're just not as powerful. You could save the points, get this guy. And when you start using, you get this unit. When you start using points as a comparison, and you have a finite number of points that you can spend, there's always going to be the leakage of what really the points are worth, and the value of each unit is going to change, and it's not necessarily going to be equal. You'll have army books that are just much more powerful for point. You'll have units in certain books that are just much more powerful, and people will spam them, or they're like defaults. They have to always be there. The fluff for the Empire, it was that there was only 10 or 12, I think, steam tanks ever in existence. The technology only warranted that there were 10 that were available. All right. But yet you would go to a game and there would be 2 every time in an Empire army. It was almost a default. It was almost an auto include. In order to win with that army, everybody had to have at least 1 or 2 steam tanks. It made you wonder if there was really only 10 and they were just factory churning these things out, because they were just everywhere. They were always there. It's a great model. It's a really, really tough model, but they were everywhere. So there was no story involving that, versus other situations where you would have, units that seemingly would be ever present, but you never saw them on the battlefield because they just weren't worth playing. They weren't competitive in that environment. Take Age of Sigmar and removing the points from the structure. As much as some people despise this, it's brilliant and beautiful in the fact that it takes all of those comparisons and chucks them out the window. And what it does is it doesn't take the emphasis on the power of the unit being the validity of that unit. You can have all the way from Nagash and Archaean all the way down to a zombie and a Skaven slave. All those and everything in between, everything has a value on the table. And if you decide that you like the aesthetic, the background, or whatever it is, if you just decide that you like the chemistry or the synergies based on the war scrolls of these various different units, and this works with your play style, or you want to test things out, however it is, it's viable in the game because you're not comparing it point for point, even if you're using wounds as a gauge, even if you're using some, some complicated, algebraic, method of calculating points, then all you're doing is just inserting another point structure. If you eliminate the concept of points and you play based on the scenario and you use the tripwires for things that like the sudden death scenarios or the scenarios that will implement certain army structures, what you're doing is you're saying, forget about what side is more powerful. Forget about what side is more weak. We're just talking about this one game in a series of games, and the next game could have implications based on what's happening here. Let's use this scenario to embrace the imbalance and forget about the point structure and having an even match. Let's talk about the scenario and the story that's applied, the narrative way of playing the game, and make it a competitive element within. And I'll give you an example. This is my favorite one to give. And this might be a minor history lesson, so I apologize if it sounds like it. But everybody's heard about the last stand of the 300. If you don't know, it's about the 300 Spartans, and what a lot of people forget, also about 800, Greek levies. That makes me 8,000 Greek levies, roughly, that defended against what people say was 1 million Persians. It wasn't. It was more like 250,000 Persians in the Battle of Thermopylae. And this is one of those ancient Greek battles that are studied in military academies. They're studied in history books. They're studied. You see them on TV shows and cable shows, and then of course in movies. And there was a naval battle that was included with this that had some mirrored similarities just because of the disparity of the forces. Persians had an overwhelming amount of forces, and the Greeks did not. They had good ground. They had good defensive ground where they could bottleneck the Persians into a small, narrow, winding pass in the mountains, and they were able to use their advantages with their armor, with their shields, with their style of combat, overlapping their shields and really compacting into a small area and basically being like the tanks of the day. And the Persians, although they had vast numbers, threw themselves at this wall and they were getting slaughtered. They could not attrit. There was not enough attrition that they could inflict upon the Greeks to warrant overcoming them. Now, if this was on an open battlefield, they could flank them, they could surround them, they could hit them from the rear, they could overwhelm them. Even shooting at them wasn't enough because of the narrow angle at which they can attack them, and the hoplite shield is this gigantic shield that they would make this huge turtle. They would turtle up and overlap the shields, and the arrows would bounce off. So they were able to hold out, but they didn't hold out indefinitely. They held out for about 3 days, and then they got wiped out to a man. But in that defense, they had inflicted tremendous casualties and hurt the morale in a lot of ways of the invading forces. And at the same time, that delay that they incurred against the Persians allowed the Greeks to organize a better defense and rally up their armies to better defend and deal with the Persians. Now, I won't go into how that is not necessarily a complete truth, but the fact is that although it was a tactical loss, it was a strategic victory. All right. And ultimately the Greeks won this war. They lost this battle, a symbolic victory, but a true loss because everybody got killed pretty much almost to a man. That is something you cannot do in a balanced game with points. You cannot emulate that. You can't make that as the crux of a game series where, I'll give you an example. Let me use some of the armies that exist in Age of Sigmar to emulate this and show you how you can create a series of scenarios linked in a string that will impact the next game and the next game in a story, and embracing the fact that these are not even matches, but in achieving certain goals, you get benefits that will carry over into later games. I've always said that Age of Sigmar works well in small to medium-sized battles. 2,000, 2,500 point equivalent battles in 8th edition is really, it starts getting bogged down once you get to that point. And really, if you get into anything that was the equivalent of 3,000 points in 8th edition, it really gets hard to keep track of things. You must have tokens. I love tokens in Age of Sigmar. I think it helps with the fluidity of the game and keeping track of who attacked, what the abilities are, all that stuff. But now let's take a look at this example. Let's say we had a mountain pass, and there was an invasion of either Skaven, or let's use orcs and goblins as an example. A horde of orcs and goblins are streaming into this mountain pass, and this is not the gates of the dwarven stronghold. This is the forward defensive fort that is the first level of defense. It's not the might of the entirety of the dwarven army. It's going to be a smaller force. They're going to be well defended, but they're certainly not going to have every resource that they have at their disposal. The vast numbers and resources are not going to be there. So a much larger force, like the full bulk of an invading army, will sweep over that eventually, certainly. But of course, those dwarves, outnumbered as they are, maybe by 1/3 to 2/3 in terms of overall size. Maybe they're outnumbered 2-1. Maybe they're outnumbered 5-1. This is the first game in a series. Use that as an example. But let's put some scenario objectives in there. The Orc and Goblin forces are determined to sweep through as quickly as possible. And they need to get to certain points in this fort. Maybe there's some battlements that they need to achieve, they need to get through. Maybe there's certain mountain areas, certain rock structures that they need to get to and overcome and get over in order to have, to gain certain victory points within this game scenario. And the dwarves, every turn that they outlast, every turn that they survive, they're getting an ever-accumulating amount of victory points, meaning they're going to take tremendous losses. They're going to take crazy losses, and those losses are certainly going to inevitably lead to their defeat. Maybe, most likely, but who knows? If they can make it turn 4, turn 6 even, and survive that long, the victory points in that game could be sufficient that it in turn becomes a victory as a game, even though they lost in the killing aspect. The orcs and goblins wipe them out, but the longer the dwarves last, the greater their victory points. And the amount of victory points they gain, there could be different levels that impact the very next game, opening up the avenue for more forces, for more diverse forces, maybe for some force selections that they can include more artillery, gyrocopters, miners, iron drakes, hammerers, eventually maybe in a third or fourth scenario. The more that the dwarves can succeed in holding off, even though they'll be losing, the tide of this overwhelming horde still goes, and flows over them and kills them all. But they're able to achieve certain benefits where when you finally get to this last string of in the chain, that final game, that culmination of all that blood and sweat and battle, the orcs and goblins could have achieved certain aims. Maybe they found a cache of runic weapons that now is in the hands of some of their heroes, and maybe there's some units that have some small boons. But then you have the achievements succeeded or failed in some cases, but whatever successes they had, the dwarves now have a larger version of their forces, more stalwart forces. Maybe they're defending better. Maybe they have some immunity or benefits for battle shock. Maybe they're, who knows? They're certainly defending on their own ground. Maybe they count as cover in all cases within their certain part of the board. All these things could be elements within these individual games leading up to this the final battle, in what is a story, a tale that could be 4 or 6 games long. It's like a mini campaign. And if you're looking to play a campaign, it could be an ongoing thing. It could be something that you could end and then you begin again with maybe different forces or even the same armies with different characters. You can make it a narrative campaign. But even so, this is the way Age of Sigmar excels. Even if it's just a small string of games, you have smaller games than you might have seen in 8th edition. You have faster games. They're streamlined. They seem like it's a basic, simple system, but it's not. But it's quicker. It's cleaner. You don't have to look up charts as much. You don't have to look up the rules as much. You play the game and it's fluid. And then you have freedom. You don't have to worry about, was this within line of sight? Can I see that unit? You move where you want to move. You have a certain measure. You move. It's much more fluid. You have formations that are only limited by your creativity and whatever geometric formations you can come up with. Either way, when you put it together in a series of games linked together with implications, you can have a completely imbalanced game that could flip on its head in the follow-up game or a couple of games in a string. If you embrace that concept, you will get Age of Sigmar. That is why scenarios are absolutely essential, the lifeblood of the game. Play it, exclude it, and you will see a very bland game that doesn't have a soul, that doesn't have any spirit, and that really, could still be played and still be fun, but just doesn't have the extra oomph that it needs. You insert that, you embrace it, you throw out the concept of over-the-top comps, even though, there's some comp ideas that I'm sure that are pretty good. I've seen a few that that even though I'm so anti-comp, but I think that have some good points, some good merits. And I've compromised that even with the gamer grunts because I'm not the only guy running the show. You take that and you run with it, and Age of Sigmar suddenly flourishes, and it becomes a really fun experience because it's just as competitive, just as engaging, but even that much more so because you have an investment in the characters, you have an investment in your army, you have an evolution beyond just the lineup and fight. You've achieved certain goals and you don't want to lose those goals. You want to build on them. And that chain it has even further investment, more so than even a special character or a named character might be, more than a role-playing game type scenario. Well, maybe not, because it's a much longer investment in a character, but it gives you much more than a game that's played individually in a vacuum. That's what I'm talking about. Now, I'm sure there are people that are not going to agree, but I challenge anybody who is remotely interested in Age of Sigmar or remotely, has tried it and had a bad experience and might want to try it again, or has not given it a chance because, they're still up, a little gun shy after, the loss of 8th edition to, and the gameplay that they're familiar with. try, if you're new to Age of Sigmar, if you've been playing it and you haven't had a decent experience, or if you've been looking to get into it, this is how it's meant to be played. This is why there are already now several resource books with story-driven scenario chains in them that have been released, these hardcover books released by GW, just hammering that point in time of everybody's head. And I am completely heartened by the idea that I'm hearing about organized events, even though I think some of the comps on some of these events are a little over the top and sometimes not so good. I heard about Holy Wars, which I love the idea of what they were doing. I mean, there's some things I don't like the allocation of wounds that I think they're doing wrong, that I heard on Warhammer Weekly, that took away from a lot of the game, but maybe they're not going to be doing it in the future. Who knows? But the thing I took away from hearing that is that there's definitely some people out there that are tournament organizers that get it. They understand that the scenery, the setting, and the story is what's paramount to Age of Sigmar. That is where the joy and the fun and the objective mindset is. I played 8th edition tournaments where there were token objectives. They really just didn't have any they didn't inspire you in the game. But when you have a series of games that are linked in a story, I'm trying to implement that within Gamer Grunts and with my own independent events that I'm doing apart from Gamer Grunts, where if you're doing 3 games in an event day, there's a tale being told. There's a story being told, no matter what army you have, and you can invest yourself in that. Try it and completely embrace it. I bet it'll, if your experience has been pretty good already, it's going to make it better. And if your experience is bad, more than likely, unless you're completely closed-minded, it'll probably be a good one. And I applaud Vince for introducing this topic, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more that TOs, tournament organizers, implement it, the more events like Holy Wars that embrace that, and the more players that understand that and don't just chuck out the scenario lists or the scenario books and just line up and fight. I think that people in general are going to have a much better time, and Age of Sigmar will be a much more pleasant experience, and even a fantastic experience. It's even for those people who may have had some negative ones in the initial phases. That happened for me too in the first couple of games. Anyway, thank you for listening to my long-winded, ongoing explanation and description. Play scenarios, and have a great night, everybody.